This is Ahav Ever from the Chronicles of Ahav Ever, and today's video is going to be how do Jews know they are Jews? So there's a really simple answer to this, and I'm going to try to do this as quickly as possible, just to not take too much time, but also to push the point across. So essentially, it's as simple as this. If someone comes from a Jewish family that has Jewish practices and they have a Jewish language, that's how they know they're Jewish. Simply put. If you want to break this down a little bit further, here's two families here in these two pictures. One on the right side is a family from Yemen, a Jewish family that came from Yemen to Israel, and the one on the left side is a Jewish family that came from Egypt. Now, a person can say, well, I don't know, I don't believe that they're Jews. Maybe they're faking. Maybe they are, imposters and things like that. Okay, well, again, I don't think either one of these families cares what anybody thinks about them. So a person could believe that and then go about their day. And if the person saying that believes that they are the true Jews and these people in these pictures are not, I don't think anybody in these pictures or their descendants or anyone else would really care. Any person can believe whatever they want. But let's just take this a little bit deeper. So here's an example. This is a picture of a Jewish man who's from Haban before coming to Israel. Haban is basically a city that was in Yemen, in southern Arabia. So the question is, how does this man know he's Jewish? Well, first of all, one of the first reasons he would know is because he was raised in an environment where the Torah, written in the Hebrew language, was kept, meaning that he was raised to keep it, to know it, to read it, to understand it in the Hebrew language, and to do it. Not just simply to kind of say, oh, well, this is our text and I'm a Jew because I say so, but specifically he and every other young person in his age group, in his community, in his neighborhood, and his family was trained in this way. He was further someone who would be wearing tefillin every day, except for on Shabbat and Chagim, like other Jews in different parts of the world. So these are two signs that he would know. He's also wearing tzitziot on the required garments to have it. He would also be keeping Sukkot at the right time with the same kind of specifications. So essentially, this is the way that this man would know that he is Jewish using our Western frame of mind, if you will. Because if he was raised in it, he was a part of it, and if he grew up in it, that's the easiest way to know that he's in it. And if it's something that, for example, a person, like let's say a person who can become a ger, can convert to being Jewish, but how does a person who converts to being Jewish know that they're Jewish? Well, the only reason they would really know, based upon the most ancient of definitions, is if they did the process the way the Torah spells it out and the way the Halakha spells it out, and if they were currently living in a Jewish community, doing all the things that we mentioned this young man was doing. But, and again, I call this a young man. He's older than me, and he actually passed away, I would say, probably about 20 or 30 years ago. But let's go a little bit deeper than that. Let's take this same man and say, well, okay, well, even with him being surrounded by things that obviously are Jewish things anciently and modernly, how does he still know he's a Jew? Maybe he picked all that stuff up, learned it for some unknown reason, practiced it for some unknown reason, and mastered it and continued to pass it on to his own children and his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren, but he must have been an imposter for some unknown reason. Okay, well, let's go even further. How does he know he's a Jewish? Well, first of all, he came from Jewish parents. That's one of the way he knows, because he came from parents who identified themselves as being Jewish, who practiced all the things we just mentioned, kept the same kind of information he was keeping, did all the same things they taught him to do, and so on and so on. But then you could ask, well, how do they know that they're Jewish? Well, first of all, because they came from Jewish parents who were doing the same things that they were teaching this man to do, keeping the same text, speaking the same language, so on and so on, and they have the same claim about their origins. But then a person could ask, well, how do they know they're Jewish? Well, they came from Jewish parents also, and were keeping the same text, doing the exact same things, so on and so on. And then a person can go, well, how does his great-grandparents know that they were Jewish? Well, they have a tradition with the same thing. They came from parents who were practicing the same thing. And they also have a claim that they came from ancient group of ancestors who lived in the distant past, who picked up the same things that they were doing, received the same things they were doing, and kept practicing the same things they were practicing. So that essentially is the easiest way to spell that out, that if a person was born and raised in a community that called themselves Jewish, they grew up practicing Jewish stuff, doing Jewish stuff, and if they themselves raise their own children to do Jewish stuff, well, obviously that would make them Jewish at some point. Now, a person could go even further with this. So, just looking at it from perspective, well, okay, the other way that you could say it is, well, let's go around the world and find other people who identify themselves as Jewish and see if they do some of the same stuff. Do they hold by the same text? Do they transmit their text in the same way? And if you find that they do, and if you find that those people are Jewish, whether they be Pashtuns, whether they be from Morocco, whether they be from Iraq, whether they be from Europe, whether they be from China, and if everybody's still doing the same thing, that same man that we saw earlier could obviously be identified as a Jew because he's doing the same stuff as everyone else. And obviously he has identified himself because of how he was raised, because of how his parents were raised, his grandparents and his great-grandparents, so on and so on, as far back as it actually could be, was practicing stuff that is a nationally, culturally, and linguistically recognized Jewish culture. So that should answer the question in a nutshell, that essentially a person who's raised in a Jewish community by Jewish parents, who sees their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents doing Jewish stuff, who's themselves taught their own children how to do Jewish stuff, at some point there would be an identification that this person would have to be Jewish, because at some point we'd have to decide, well, what would make them a fake Jew? If all of this stuff were the situation where they had family members who throughout the last number of uncountable generations, were practicing these things. Well, again, we get into several issues again, that if we go back through all of these generations and generations, we see the same stuff happening, the same text being kept, the same practices, the same kind of culture, obviously it would be pretty clear that someone who has all of those things could claim to be Jewish. Now, what if someone, for example, was open to say, well, my family only goes back 2 generations practicing these things? Well, that's perfectly fine. If the greater Jewish community accepts those people as being Jews, then they're Jews. And if the greater Jewish community doesn't accept them as being Jews, obviously if they believed that they were Jews, they would keep practicing that stuff even without recognition. So I think for the most part, a situation existed where someone who is not a part of the Jewish community, or believes that they are the real Jewish community, or believes something entirely different about themselves, were to try to challenge someone in the situations we just mentioned and say, well, I don't believe that you're a Jew. I've seen this book over here somewhere that says that the Jews of the day aren't the real Jews. Well, the response to that from a Torah Mashay Jew would be, so what? Who cares? Seriously. I mean, there's people who write books about anything. I mean, if that's the case, you should believe everything that's written in somebody's book somewhere, including books that we have that say that we are. So, again, a person has to determine, what is their determining, what is their milestone or their measuring methodology for saying, okay, well, this person decides that the Jews aren't the real Jews. Well, the silly part about that is, how did he determine who the real Jews were to begin with? Did he go out and find some real Jews from several thousand years ago and like look up their DNA? And if so, where in their text and in their culture does it say that someone can't join their culture and be a part of it? Because I can tell you one thing, the Torah talks about that specifically. The Hebrew text of the Torah makes it clear that any person who becomes what's called a ger tzedek and joins the Jewish community is a Jew and is a part of the Jewish community. So that's from Jewish law, Torah halacha, essentially, and again, it just becomes one of these quagmires where it's like, for example, a person could be just looking for some reason to try to say, well, the Jews who claim to be Jews and who grew up as Jews and who learn Hebrew and use Jewish text and all those things, well, I don't want to believe that they're Jew because I'm the real thing, they're not. And if you ask that same person, okay, do your parents hold by that? They might not. Do your grandparents hold by that? Well, they might not either. And even if they did, and even if they did, the Jewish community doesn't care. The Jewish community is doing what it's going to do and is going to continue because that's the same thing that was received from Jewish parents, from grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on. And if a person says, I don't believe it, so what? Who cares? That's just the reality. So what? Who cares? So would it be a coincidence if someone were raised in the way that we just mentioned, living in the culture we just mentioned, and had parents and grandparents and great-grandparents who were doing the same thing? Is it a coincidence that all of a sudden they think that they're Jewish somehow? Well, I guess it depends on what someone wants to define as being coincidence, because consider the following. Let's say you have a man who was born in Ghana. grew up with Ghanaian parents who identified themselves as Ghanaian parents, and everyone else around them identified them as Ghanaian. And what if his grandparents are also Ghanaian, or were identified as being Ghanaian, and had Ghanaian citizenship, so on and so on, from whatever time? At what point is a person Ghanaian if they were raised as a Ghanaian and lived amongst Ghanaian parents and grandparents and great grandparents? At what point are they not? Well, obviously, someone who wasn't raised in Ghana, wasn't raised as Ghanaian, doesn't speak the language, wouldn't be a Ghanaian. They might be a Ghanaian by ancestry, but they wouldn't be if they don't practice it. So essentially, I think that should answer the question that of how there are Jews who know that they're Jewish, and I think what it is that there are some people who want to be considered Jewish, who sometimes have these issues with people who have been raised as being Jewish. And I think the simple truth is this: if a person believes that they're Jewish, then they should just do what they think Jewish people do and be happy with whatever they're doing. And if a person wasn't raised that way by their parents or their grandparents or their great grandparents, and however far that goes back, well, then that's something that they have to settle with the creator of all things, because either they were caused to be in that situation or they were allowed to be in it. But that has nothing to do with the Jewish community who was raised in it, has kept it, and has been doing it and transmits it to their own children, so on and so on. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. Thank you and bye.